The room was already watching him before anyone spoke. It wasn't obvious at first. No staring, no open hostility. Just the quiet assessment that happened when a man didn't quite fit where he stood. The hallway outside the training complex buzzed with activity. Officers moving between briefings, boots striking tile, low conversations clipped and efficient. In the center of it all stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in a plain dark shirt and utility pants. Sleeves rolled just enough to expose forearms corded with muscle and faintly raised veins. He stood relaxed, hands loose at his sides, posture straight without being rigid. A few people assumed he was support staff. Others guessed contractor. No one guessed correctly. He waited patiently near the check-in desk, eyes forward, expression calm. He had learned long ago that impatience drew attention, and attention invited questions. Questions in the wrong hands turned into problems. The problem arrived in the form of a single voice. "Well," the officer said, loud enough for the space to hear, "can I help you, or are you just wandering?" The speaker was a senior officer, chest full of ribbons, confidence overflowing his uniform. He stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, gaze traveling deliberately from the man's boots to his shoulders and back again. The look carried amusement, dismissal, a certainty that he was about to enjoy the next few moments. "I'm here for the briefing," the man replied evenly. That was enough. The officer laughed, not sharply, not angrily. It was the kind of laugh that assumed agreement from everyone else in the room. A few nearby paused. Someone smirked. Another officer glanced over, curious. "You?" the officer said. "This is restricted, military only." "I know," the man said. The officer tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly as if this were a game. "Then prove it." The words landed heavier than they sounded. They weren't a request. They were a challenge, issued in public, designed to strip away credibility in front of witnesses. The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and placed a small object into his palm. A coin. Not large, not flashy. Dark metal, worn at the edges. The kind of thing that meant nothing to civilians and everything to the right people. He held it out without ceremony, resting flat in his open hand. The officer's smile lingered for half a second longer than it should have. Then it vanished. He leaned forward, instinctively eyes locking onto the markings. Confusion flickered first, then recognition. His posture changed before his expression did, shoulders squaring, arms dropping to his sides. A second officer stepped closer, then stopped short, breath catching as he saw it too. The hallway went quiet. No one laughed now. The officer straightened fully, color draining from his face. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again as if the words needed permission to come out. Finally, he did the only thing left to him. He stood at attention. The man closed his hand around the coin and slipped it back into his pocket, face unchanged. He hadn't wanted this moment to be public. He rarely did. But some challenges couldn't be avoided without giving up something far more important. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments where are you watching from. It helps more than you know. The officer cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on him. "My apologies," he said stiffly. "Sir," the word echoed. The man gave a single nod. Nothing more. He stepped past without brushing shoulders, without triumph, without acknowledgement of the shift that had just occurred. He walked toward the briefing room doors as conversations tried and failed to restart behind him. Inside, the air was cooler, controlled, familiar. What no one in that hallway understood, what the officer had only just begun to grasp, was that the coin wasn't a symbol of rank. It wasn't proof of status, it was proof of access, of trust granted quietly and never explained. It marked someone who operated in spaces where titles blurred and authority came from results, not insignia. The man took his seat near the back of the room, folding his hands loosely, gaze forward. Around him, officers shuffled papers, whispered questions, cast glances they quickly looked away from. The briefing hadn't started yet, but the atmosphere had already shifted. Outside, the officer who had laughed stood frozen a moment longer, replaying the image in his mind. The markings, the weight of the silence, the realization that he had just tested someone who had never needed to prove anything at all. And before the day was over, that realization would cost him far more than pride. The briefing began 6 minutes late. No one mentioned it out loud, but everyone noticed. Schedules in places like this were tight by design. Delays meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant something had already gone wrong, or was about to. The tall man remained seated near the back, shoulders relaxed, spine straight, forearms resting lightly against the table. The veins along his arms stood out subtly beneath his skin, not from tension but from the simple fact of how he was built. He watched the room the way he always did, without staring, without withdrawing, present but not demanding attention. The officer who had laughed earlier entered last. His posture was different now, less expansive, less sure. He avoided looking toward the back row as he took his place near the front, clearing his throat twice before settling into his chair. A few officers noticed. No one commented. The lights dimmed slightly as the main display flickered on, filling the wall with maps and timelines. A senior facilitator began the overview, voice steady, rehearsed. The subject was regional stability, asset coordination, contingency planning, familiar ground. The man listened. He always listened. Others around the table took notes aggressively as if documentation itself could create authority. Some leaned forward, eager to speak when the moment came. Others leaned back, arms crossed, projecting confidence without substance. The man cataloged all of it quietly, the way he had been trained to do years earlier. When the facilitator reached the section on response readiness, the officer at the front interjected. "We've assessed all known variables," he said. "Our coverage is sufficient." The words were firm, final. The man didn't move. He waited through the silence that followed, through the subtle glances exchanged between officers who weren't convinced but didn't want to challenge rank. He waited because timing mattered more than being right. Then he spoke, respectfully. He said, voice even, not loud. "There's a blind spot along the southern corridor that hasn't been accounted for." A ripple moved through the room. Heads turned. Pens paused. The officer stiffened. Slowly he turned in his chair. "And you base that on?" he asked. "Pattern overlap," the man replied. "Logistics, movement frequency, and an assumption that hasn't been tested." The officer's jaw tightened. "We've run simulations." "Yes," the man said calmly, "with inputs that assume cooperation." A few officers shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The facilitator hesitated, then looked between them. "Are you suggesting a revision?" "I'm suggesting a delay," the man said, "and a verification." The officer leaned forward now, hands flat on the table. "That would require reallocating assets, which you are not authorized to recommend." The man met his gaze for the first time since the hallway. Not challenging, not submissive, simply direct. "I'm authorized to warn," he said. "What you do with it is your decision." Silence settled again. The facilitator cleared his throat. "We'll note the concern and—" The officer raised a hand sharply. "No," he said. "We'll proceed as planned." The man nodded once, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. He leaned back slightly, eyes returning to the display. Around him the room exhaled, tension easing just enough for conversation to continue. But something had changed. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, inappropriate in hindsight. A few officers glanced back toward him, curiosity replacing dismissal. The briefing continued, but it moved differently. Questions were asked more carefully. Statements softened. Even the officer moderated his tone, though irritation still flickered beneath it. When the session ended, chairs scraped back and conversations erupted in low clusters. The man stood, gathering his materials with unhurried precision. An officer he didn't recognize approached him cautiously. "That coin," the officer said quietly. "I've only seen one like it once." The man gave a faint, non-committal nod. "Didn't think so," the officer muttered and stepped away. As the room emptied, the officer from the hallway lingered near the front, clearly debating something. Finally, he turned and approached. "I didn't know," he said stiffly. The man regarded him calmly. "You didn't ask?" The officer's lips pressed together. "That coin carries weight. It carries responsibility," the man replied. The officer swallowed. "If you have concerns, you should have brought them directly to me." "I did," the man said. "Just not in the way you expected." The officer looked away, jaw flexing. "This isn't over." "No," the man agreed. "It isn't." He walked past, leaving the officer standing alone amid empty chairs and darkened screens. Down the corridor, the man paused briefly at a window overlooking the base. He allowed himself one slow breath, not relief, preparation, because the concern he had raised wasn't theoretical, and by the time it became undeniable, the room would remember exactly who had tried to warn them. The warning didn't stay theoretical for long. By the next morning, the base had shifted into a quieter rhythm, the kind that came not from calm but from anticipation. Radios chirped more often. Couriers moved with purpose. Briefings multiplied. The man noticed it all as he walked the perimeter route he favored, boots striking pavement in a steady cadence. Physical training had always been his anchor. It kept the body honest and the mind clear. His muscles moved easily beneath his shirt, strength held in reserve rather than displayed. Years of discipline had carved that habit into him as deeply as the veins that traced his forearms. He wasn't trying to look imposing, he simply was. Inside the operations building, a junior officer intercepted him. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, "they've rerun the models." The man nodded. "And? There's overlap, not much, but enough." "Enough is enough," the man said. The junior officer hesitated. "The decision authority still says proceed." "They would," the man replied, "until they don't." He continued down the corridor past doors marked with clearances most people never questioned. He didn't enter them. Not yet. He wasn't there in that capacity. Not officially. At noon, a second briefing was called. Smaller, tighter, fewer seats filled, but the tension was heavier. The officer who had scoffed in the hallway stood near the front again, jaw set, confidence worn thinner this time. He spoke quickly, asserting control before anyone else could. "We've reviewed the data," he said. "The deviation is marginal." The man remained seated, hands folded loosely, eyes forward. A projection lit up behind the officer. Lines and arrows tracing movements across a digital map. He spoke over it, voice firm, but the room was no longer fully with him. Officers leaned in, murmured to one another. Doubt had a way of spreading once it was named. "Permission to speak," the man said calmly. The officer stiffened. "Granted." The man stood, slowly, smoothly. He didn't raise his voice when he spoke, and that made people listen more closely. "The deviation isn't marginal," he said. "It's masked. The pattern only emerges when you stop assuming compliance." A pause followed. "And if you're wrong," the officer snapped. "Then you lose time," the man replied. "Or if I'm right, you lose people." The room went still. No one laughed now. The facilitator cleared his throat. "What are you recommending?" "A hold," the man said, "and a quiet verification through channels that don't appear on your board." The officer shook his head. "You don't have the authority." The man met his gaze again. "I have the responsibility." Something passed between them then. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. The facilitator looked down at his notes, then back up. "We'll escalate for review." The officer opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. He had learned something since the hallway. When certain lines were crossed, resistance became visible, and visibility carried consequences. The meeting adjourned without resolution. That afternoon, the man received a message on a device most people didn't know he carried. No name attached. No pleasantries. Just coordinates and a single line of text. "Confirmed. Stand by." He exhaled slowly. Not relief. Confirmation. Elsewhere on the base, the officer was being asked questions he didn't like. Quiet ones. The kind delivered behind closed doors by people who didn't explain why they were asking. His confidence eroded another degree with each answer. By evening, the man sat alone in a spare office, lights dim, reviewing material he had memorized years ago and never forgotten. This was the other job, the one without applause, the one that required patience, silence, and the willingness to be underestimated. He allowed himself a brief moment of stillness, forearms resting on the desk, veins standing out under the soft light, not from strain, but from the weight of what came next. Because once verification became action, there would be no hiding behind rank or laughter. And the officer who had demanded proof in public was about to learn that some credentials didn't come on paper, and some warnings once ignored never came twice. By sunrise, the base would be operating under new assumptions, and the man's quiet role was about to become impossible to deny. By dawn, the assumptions were already changing. The base didn't announce it. No alarms, no speeches, just a subtle tightening of procedures that only experienced eyes would notice. Access points adjusted. Flight schedules shifted by minutes instead of hours. Radios switched to alternate frequencies without explanation. To most, it felt like routine caution. To the man, it felt like confirmation. He stood on the edge of the flight line, arms relaxed at his sides, watching the morning haze lift off the tarmac. The air smelled of fuel and salt carried in from the coast. Muscles moved easily beneath his shirt as he shifted his weight. Tall frame steady, unhurried. He looked like someone waiting. He was. Behind him, hurried footsteps approached. "Sir," a voice said quietly. He turned to see the same junior officer from the day before, eyes alert now, not uncertain. "They've issued a temporary hold," the officer said. "Unofficially. Asset redeployment is underway." The man nodded once. "Good. They didn't credit you," the officer added, unsure if that mattered. "It doesn't," the man said. Inside the command building, the officer who had laughed in the hallway was having a very different morning. His office door had been closed for over an hour. Voices rose and fell inside, controlled but firm. When the door finally opened, he stepped out with his jacket in hand, face pale, posture stiff in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. Across the corridor, the man watched without expression. Their eyes met briefly. The officer looked away first. A smaller briefing followed mid-morning. No raised voices, no dismissive laughter. The facilitator spoke carefully, choosing words like tools rather than weapons. When the man offered an observation, it was written down immediately. No one challenged him. No one joked. The room had learned. Afterward, as officers filtered out in tight groups, a colonel approached him. Older, sharper eyes, the kind of man who had survived long enough to recognize patterns before they announced themselves. "That coin," the colonel said quietly. "It doesn't circulate anymore." "No," the man agreed. "You were selected early," the colonel continued, "before most of us realized what the future would require." The man said nothing. The colonel studied him for a moment longer. "You won't get credit for what's coming." "I didn't ask for it," the man replied. The colonel nodded slowly. "That tracks." Word moved fast after that, though no one admitted it was moving at all. The officer's name stopped appearing on planning documents. His authority narrowed, then thinned. Meetings happened without him. Decisions were made elsewhere. By evening, the man received another message. Short, final, proceed. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. That night, he walked the perimeter again, muscles loose, breathing steady. He thought briefly of the hallway, the laughter, the coin resting heavy in his palm, not with satisfaction, with distance. Those moments were tools, not victories. The real work happened after the noise faded. Somewhere beyond the horizon, assets were repositioning quietly, guided by assumptions that no longer existed on paper. The blind spot he had warned about was being sealed without announcement, without credit, and the officer who had demanded proof would spend the rest of his career wondering which moment had cost him everything. The laugh, the challenge, or the silence that followed. What no one yet understood was that the correction they'd just made wasn't enough, and the man was about to be asked to step out of the background for the first time. The request came after midnight, not through official channels, not logged, not announced. A secure message appeared on the device he rarely needed to check, carrying only a time and a location. No explanation. None was required. He arrived alone. The room was smaller than the main command spaces, tucked deep within the facility where concrete thickened and signals narrowed. No windows, no insignia on the walls. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a screen already lit when he entered. 2 figures stood when he stepped inside. Neither introduced themselves. They didn't need to. One gestured toward the chair. "We should have listened sooner." The man sat, posture straight, forearms resting lightly on the table. The veins along his arms were visible now, not from tension, but from the way the light fell across muscle shaped by years of controlled strain. His expression remained calm, professional. "What changed?" he asked. The screen shifted, displaying data that hadn't been shared in any briefing. Movement patterns, intercepts, confirmations layered on top of the blind spot he'd flagged days earlier. "You were right," one of them said. "And early," the man nodded once. "Then we're late." "Not yet," the other replied, "because you were already in position." Silence settled. "You know why you were selected," the first said. Not because of rank, not because of visibility, because when things don't fit, you don't force them to. You step back and look for what everyone else assumes away. The man didn't respond. We need you to operate openly now, the second said. Briefings, authority, direct input. No, the man replied evenly. Both figures paused. I'll advise, he continued. I won't command. That's not why you chose me. They exchanged a look. After a moment, the first nodded. As expected, the meeting ended without ceremony. No handshakes, no congratulations. The man stood, nodded once, and left. By morning, the consequences became visible. The officer who had scoffed in the hallway was formally relieved of his remaining responsibilities. No announcement, just an absence. His name removed from schedules, his access quietly revoked. The correction was clean, surgical, and irreversible. The base adjusted again, this time without resistance. In the following days, the man attended briefings openly, not at the back, not hidden, still not at the head of the table, but no one mistook his presence for coincidence anymore. When he spoke, rooms listened. When he paused, people waited. He didn't enjoy it. Late one evening, he stood alone outside the facility, cool air settling against his skin. For the first time since the hallway, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Not pride, not satisfaction, just the weight of what it meant to be seen after years of deliberate obscurity. Visibility was a tool, but it was also a cost. He thought of the coin again, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of obligation. Once revealed, it couldn't be unseen. Once authority shifted, it never fully returned to where it had been. Inside, planning continued at a new pace. Assumptions were challenged. Blind spots narrowed. People spoke more carefully. The system had corrected itself, but correction was never the end, because as the man knew better than anyone in that room, fixing what had been ignored only exposed the next flaw waiting beneath it. What began as a public humiliation had become a quiet transfer of trust, and the final reckoning was still one decision away. The reckoning didn't arrive with spectacle. No sirens, no emergency sessions, no raised voices echoing through corridors. It came the way real consequences always did, quietly and all at once. By the end of the week, the blind spot was gone. Assets had been repositioned with precision that never made the daily brief. Schedules shifted in ways that looked administrative to anyone not trained to see the seams. Patrols intersected where they never had before. The assumptions that once guided planning were replaced by verified realities. Nothing failed. Nothing was lost. And that absence, the lack of crisis, the lack of casualty reports, the lack of late-night calls, was the proof that mattered. The man stood in the briefing room again, this time near the center of the table, not at the head, never there. His role had not changed in title, but it no longer needed explanation. When he spoke, notes were taken. When he raised a concern, it was tested immediately. When he was silent, people waited to see if that silence carried warning. The officer who had laughed was gone, not transferred, not reassigned, removed. No announcement followed. No one said his name aloud anymore. The correction had been thorough enough that mentioning him felt unnecessary, almost impolite. Like speaking of a structural flaw after the building had already been reinforced. One afternoon, as the room emptied, the colonel approached again. You could have let him fall harder, the colonel said quietly. The man gathered his materials, movements unhurried. That wasn't the point. No, the colonel agreed. It never is with people like you. They stood for a moment in silence, the low hum of the building filling the space between them. Will you stay visible? The colonel asked. The man considered the question. As long as it's required. And after? He looked toward the doorway where officers passed without glancing now, not out of dismissal but out of certainty. Then I'll step back. Someone else will need to be underestimated. The colonel smiled faintly. That tracks. Later that evening, the man returned to his quarters, removed the coin from his pocket, and placed it carefully into a drawer. It would stay there. It always did once its purpose was served. The coin wasn't meant to be displayed. It wasn't meant to win arguments. It existed for moments when proof was demanded, and silence afterward was the real outcome. What had begun as public humiliation had ended as quiet correction. The room that once laughed had learned. The system that once resisted had adjusted. And the man, exactly where he had always been meant to be, returned to operating without notice. Because real authority didn't announce itself. It revealed itself once, and then disappeared again. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.